Do you worry that RMDs could quietly cost you tens of thousands in extra taxes? You didn't save for decades just to end up paying more to the IRS than you need to. So in this video, I'll show you whether RMDs are actually a threat to your retirement, the tax mistake that costs retirees thousands when it doesn't have to, and how to stay in control of your savings even if tax rates rise. To start, I'm going to show you what makes so many retirees worry about RMDs, and whether they're actually as dangerous as they sound, using Mike and Kathy as an example. They had saved $2 million and it was all in pre-tax accounts. So by the time they reach RMD age, they'd be forced to withdraw nearly $100,000 per year. And because that extra income stacks on top of any other income sources, it can lead to higher taxes and increased Medicare premiums. And I know $100,000 sounds like a massive amount, but what does that forced withdrawal actually mean for Mike and Kathy's retirement? So let's look at their tax bracket over time. Right here is where RMDs kick in at age 75, and this makes their income jump, but it doesn't actually push them into a higher bracket. So even as the government forces them to take more and more out of their retirement accounts, their income stays in the same bracket it always has, and it never actually leads to a higher tax bracket. But tax brackets are just one piece of the puzzle. Medicare premiums have their own brackets, and if your income is just $1 too high, it can lead to thousands of dollars more per year in premium costs. And to see whether RMDs will push you into higher tax brackets or increase your Medicare premiums, I'll include a link for free access to this same software below. So now let's flip this from ordinary income brackets to Medicare premium brackets. Even with over $2 million saved and a six-figure RMD, it still doesn't push Mike and Kathy into higher costs at any point in retirement. So even for a couple with $2 million in pre-tax accounts, RMDs don't automatically lead to higher taxes and increased Medicare premiums. But even after seeing this, retirees still worry about RMDs for two reasons. And one of these turns out to be more noise than danger, but the other can get expensive fast if you aren't prepared for it. Reason number one is that the national debt is growing faster than ever, and most retirees think tax rates have nowhere to go but up. But here's why this almost certainly won't happen. A recent survey found that nearly 6 in 10 Americans say their taxes are too high. And this is consistent across all levels of income, with the survey finding that there are no meaningful differences in perceptions of tax fairness across lower, middle, and upper income Americans. So the reality is that even as the national debt continues to climb, raising individual income taxes is so unpopular that it's unlikely any politician will actually do it. But even though people are against raising taxes on individuals, an overwhelming majority feel like corporations don't pay enough in taxes. So if the government does raise tax rates, it's more likely to be on corporations or the ultra-wealthy, not the typical retiree living on Social Security and IRA withdrawals. Now, the second concern is a trap that catches a lot of couples off guard if they don't plan for it. So let's go back to Mike and Kathy's plan so you can see what that trap is and the simple way to avoid it. This is the same tax bracket chart we looked at earlier. Even if they both live into their 90s, RMDs won't push them into a higher bracket. But there's one risk that can trigger a massive tax trap without any warning. Right now, our plan assumes both Mike and Kathy live to age 95. But instead of both living to 95, let's adjust this to see what happens if Mike were to pass away at 85. Once we switch this and go back to the page showing their tax bracket, you can see the same income and the same RMDs now push them into a higher bracket later on. And this doesn't just cause higher taxes. When we switch over to the Medicare premium brackets, Kathy would immediately cross multiple Medicare thresholds once Mike passes away, and her premiums would go up by nearly $3,000 per year. And the reason this happens is called the widow's trap. The tax brackets for a single filer are half the size of a married couple. So Kathy would have the same accounts with the same RMDs, but now she'd be paying much higher taxes and Medicare premiums. So with tomorrow never being guaranteed, how do you avoid paying thousands more in taxes and Medicare premiums if your spouse were to pass away? Well, let me show you 3 simple moves you can do right now that reduce the widow's trap and shrink future RMDs. Let's go back to Mike and Kathy's tax bracket chart. In the widow scenario, Kathy eventually gets pushed into a higher bracket, so every RMD later gets taxed at a higher rate. But when we look at today, there's a lot of space between their income and the top of their current bracket. And this is because early in retirement, they're spending money from their brokerage account first and letting their IRAs keep growing until RMDs start. So instead, the first strategy is to pull more from pre-tax accounts while they're still in that lower bracket. In doing this, reduces the size of their IRAs later, which means smaller RMDs and less chance they're forced into a higher bracket. Now, the second strategy is for couples who have room in a lower bracket but don't need more spending money. In Mike and Kathy's plan, we can use this extra space in the 22% bracket for the next few years to do Roth conversions. So instead of pulling money out and spending it or putting it in a taxable account, now it's growing tax-free for the rest of retirement. But before I show you the third strategy, I need to show you the mistake that I see so many retirees make with their conversions, and it causes them to overpay in taxes even if it reduces their RMDs. When we look at the Roth conversion strategy we just added for Mike and Kathy, it looks like the perfect amount. It fills up the 22% bracket right at the top. But income tax brackets aren't the only bracket we need to worry about. Let's switch this over to Medicare brackets and see where this conversion falls. What Mike and Kathy thought was the perfect amount is actually just enough to push them over the first Medicare threshold, adding a couple $1,000s each year to their premiums. So even if it saves them taxes later on, they're just paying it to the government in extra Medicare premiums. But if doing nothing means higher taxes later on, and conversions mean higher Medicare premiums, which do you choose? Well, to see exactly what the best strategy is, instead of just guessing, you can access the software for free below and run your own numbers. And for Mike and Kathy, once we ran their numbers, they found out they actually didn't have to make that choice. Let's go back to our conversion strategy. Instead of filling up the 22% bracket, we cap the conversion so their income stays just under the Medicare threshold. And because that cap is lower, we spread conversions out across their retirement instead of just doing them for a few years. And once we do that, now their income stays right underneath that Medicare threshold, both early in retirement and later on if the widow scenario happens. But instead of having to spend your entire retirement constantly trying to keep your income at exactly the right amount, you can just use this third strategy. And it can create more tax savings than many retirees get over their lifetime, and it'll only take you a few minutes to implement. This next page shows the allocation of Mike and Kathy's investments. There's 70% stocks, and right now they hold that same mix in every account. But the problem with this is that stocks tend to grow faster than bonds over time. So if stocks are spread evenly across the accounts, a lot of that growth ends up inside the pre-tax IRA, which can lead to bigger future RMDs and a bigger tax bill. So instead, we keep their overall risk the same, but we change where the growth happens. We place more of the stocks in the Roth and more of the bonds in the IRA. And this doesn't make them more aggressive overall. We're just being intentional about which account gets the faster growing assets. And this might sound like a small change, but let's go back to the RMD chart and see the impact. Before the change, their RMDs grew to over $300,000 a year in their 90s. But with this adjustment, they have all their money in Roth and taxable accounts by their mid-80s, and they no longer have to worry about RMDs at all. And when you add it up, that single shift can reduce their lifetime tax bill by over $300,000. So if you built up a large pre-tax balance and you're worried about big RMDs later on, these three strategies can shrink your RMDs and end up saving you hundreds of thousands in taxes. But the problem is some couples are already past the best window to use lower brackets, and others have simply had strong market growth and their RMDs are bigger than they expected. But even if you do have big RMDs, you can still keep them from turning into higher taxes or higher Medicare premiums. So let me show you two simple ways you can do this. The first is for retirees who are already giving to charity. Once you're 70 and a half, you can use something called a Qualified Charitable Distribution, or QCD. A QCD lets you donate directly from your IRA to a qualified charity. That donation counts towards your RMD, but it doesn't show up as taxable income on your return. So instead of taking the RMD, paying the tax, and then giving it to charity, you can give pre-tax dollars straight to the causes you care about and reduce the tax impact of your RMD at the same time. And the second strategy is one you hope you never need, but it can make a huge difference on your taxes if you do. So for a lot of retirees, RMDs don't feel big until their 80s and 90s. Their accounts keep growing, the required withdrawals get larger, but spending often slows down. But one part of spending often actually goes up with age, which are medical costs, including the risk of needing long-term care. But with those higher medical expenses comes a tax loophole that most retirees have never had access to. Under current law, you can deduct any medical expenses over 7.5% of your total income. So if you have high medical or long-term care expenses in a given year, you can use those to offset the taxes from your RMDs. And this means far less tax consequences from those same big RMDs later on. But even when retirees stop worrying about RMDs, they still struggle with a bigger fear, worrying that spending too much early in retirement will make them run out of money later. So watch this next, and I'll show you how to avoid that same mistake.